Okay, so we're going to have a look at Pygmalion, which was written by George Bernard Shaw, and for this presentation I'm going to be telling you a little bit about George Bernard Shaw and the historical context whereby he wrote this play. Right, let's start with the first slide that I have here. You'll see in the preface, this is a small bit that George Bernard Shaw himself wrote in his preface to the play, which I think will give you an idea already of what the play itself is about. Right, let's take a look at the historical context. The play is based in the Victorian period, if you like. It's a reaction to the Victorian period. What you'll see here is, I've written the dates of the early Victorian period. The Victorian era itself was a period of dramatic change which brought England at the time to its highest point of development as a world power. London itself grew from a population of around 2 million when Queen Victoria came to the throne to about 6.5 million by the time of her death, which also indicates a dramatic transition from a way of life based on land ownership to the modern urban economy. There was also an enormous increase in wealth at the time in England, but also a very rapid and unregulated industrialisation, which brought about a host of social and economic problems. Most of you will know about the industrialisation from history lessons. The early Victoria period, so this is what's written here, 1830 to 1848, saw, for example, the opening of Britain's first railway, its first reform parliament, but it was also a time of economic distress. And the early Victorian writers were responding to the social changes, i.e. the shift from an agricultural to an industrial society, the shift away from the traditional beliefs, the decline in traditional religious beliefs. They adopted a moral aesthetic and maintained that literature itself should provide fresh values and understanding of the newly emerging society of the time. They also examined the complications of forming a personal identity in a world where the social structures, therefore the strength of the church and so on, in a world where these were actually breaking down. The mid-Victorian period was also not free of harassing problems, but it was nonetheless a time of prosperity, optimism and stability in the country. By the 1970s, art was starting to oppose what by now was perceived as repressive aesthetic. Writers began to reject any obligation to produce moral art. In fiction, we see a return to prose fantasy, such as those displayed in the works of Robert Louis Stevenson, like Jekyll and Hyde, although this was indeed written in 1886, but as a reaction to, and of course Lewis Carroll's Alice in Wonderland, which was written in 1865. Moving on now to the later Victorian period, where the costs of the empire were becoming increasingly apparent and England was confronted by growing threats to its military and economic preeminence. There were extreme inequities between men and women at the time, and this stimulated a debate about women's roles, which was known as the woman question. It also saw a period of more searching realism, which was accompanied by the emergence of the so-called problem novel, in which the institution of marriage and traditional relations between sexes were re-examined. Sexual anarchy was arriving. A fallen woman was replaced by the new woman. The social structures oppressing women became themes of play such as Oscar Wilde and Bernard Shaw. And novels of Thomas Hardy started in on this theme as well. The influence of Darwin's Origin of Species, which was written in 1859, was starting to be felt quite strongly now. What you saw here was you had Hardy's Tess of the D'Urbervilles, which was written in 1891, and Jude the Obscure from 1896, which show a very bleak and open treatment of sexuality and marriage, both of which actually, when they were published, caused an outrage among the nonetheless puritanical Victorian public. The naturalists, influenced by Darwin, believed, of course, that human animal was a creature which was conditioned by influences beyond his or her control, believed, therefore, that they were largely devoid of free will or moral choice. They were shaped purely by external factors such as hereditary environment and the pressure of immediate circumstances. And we see this actually in the play. You will see as we start to read the play that Eliza actually only changes on the outside alone in this play. At the turn of the century, leading up to World War I, there was another primary concern of writers of the period, which was mainly sexuality and sexual mores. And you see this, of course, in Lawrence's Lady Chatterley's Lover from 1928, where he depicts sexuality in a very forthright manner, which was an integral part of his crusade against the constricting and sterile values which he felt of the modern civilization of the time. Right, let's move on to the background to Pygmalion and to George Bernard Shaw himself. Shaw was born in Dublin in 1856 and left school at 14. His mother actually moved to London in 1876 to be a music teacher, and he later followed her there. He himself was very, very interested in social reform and also became a music critic. He was a great, great fan of Wagner. And in his music criticism, he mocks conventional tastes and fashionable preferences, which you can also see in his literary works, such as Pygmalion. He actually started his career as a novelist and published in socialist journals. He was a very active socialist and also very active in any anarchist political movements, and was one of the founders of the Fabian Society, which was erected for the promotion of socialism. Like Ibsen, he wanted to use his plays to shock public out of their complacency and acquiescence of what he saw as social evil. But to make his published plays more accessible to the reading public, he added novelistic stage directions and lengthy essays, prefatory essays, in which he reveals his mastery of the English prose. When you read this piece, you must start, of course, by reading the preface, and then what you will see as you're reading the play, that he does have incredible stage directions, which go into very, very tiny, minute details as to where furniture is placed and what colour it is. His influence on the 20th century drama scene was absolutely profound. He revolutionised the overwhelmingly over-melodramatic Victorian stage with his drama of ideas. So Shaw was a huge fan of phonetics and correct English, as you saw with the quote at the very, very start of this presentation. What you see here is a few things that would have bothered Shaw. Why, for example, is there a B in subtle if we don't pronounce it? English itself, the written version of it, doesn't always make sense. We see this in his plays. He has a very idiosyncratic type of spelling. He believes in the correct pronunciation, but there are certain aspects to the writing of the language which he saw as unnecessary. But one thing that does come through in this play is the magic of teaching. He really thoroughly believes in the power of teaching and the power of words. So a very brief reference to Cinderella, as you'll no doubt hear people referring to Pygmalion as a type of Cinderella play. There are very obvious references to Cinderella in the play. For example, the slippers, but the slippers are actually thrown from Cinderella to the Prince Charming character, if you like. She doesn't wear them. And there are parties. There's not exactly a ball, but there are parties. There is a stepmother involved. We don't actually get to meet her, but she's there. As I say, the sort of Prince Charming character, there is a lead character who you could consider to be Prince Charming, though he's not exactly terribly charming. And the most interesting point is there's an open end to the play rather than the typical happy ending, although later on Shaw did write an ending to his play to satisfy all the people who complained that it didn't have a happy ending. Whether or not you think the new ending is a happy ending is also debatable, but I certainly recommend that everybody reads the extra bit that Shaw added on at the end. Finally, here are some references which can be interesting to refer to after you've read the play. I wish everyone a great deal of pleasure reading the play. It really is good fun. Honestly, enjoy.